Conclude. Okay, and I'm excited to introduce another research person. Today's speaker is Dr. Jane Foster, and he got her BA and master's at Yale University. Her master's in forest science, and then she went on to get a PhD in forestry at University of Wisconsin at Madison. She spent several years doing postdocs and research fellows and research professors at UW and also University of Vermont. When finally, a couple years ago, I was able to steal her and get her as a Forest Service scientist. So Jane does a lot of large scale modeling that I think she's going to talk about today. Some really cool stuff. And those of you who are interested in those kinds of large data sets, so she's going to talk about at-risk spruce-fir forests.
Susan. So am I loud enough? Can everyone hear me okay? Okay, great. So thank you for inviting me to speak here today. And it's great to come and just talk about research and also get to meet folks here at Clemson. It's my first time here. So I'm going to be talking about high elevation spruce-fir forests on the Appalachian Mountains and why we're interested in how they're changing, if they're changing, where they're changing. And this picture is just a picture of the northern Appalachians. You can see that green evergreen forest at the top of the mountains. Those are montane spruce-fir forests, and there's just this question about what's going to happen to them as temperatures continue warming, climate's changing, and other environmental factors and disturbance factors are changing over time. So one of the species we're interested in this forest is red spruce, partly because it's this interesting relict species from glacial times. It has a distribution that extends down the Appalachian Mountains in patches on sort of sky islands and in mountaintops. And it's been able to persist in these environments since the last glaciation. This is an example of one of these small populations of red spruce, the evergreen, in this picture that's in Hickory Run State Park in Pennsylvania, which is sort of right here in northeastern Pennsylvania. But these species extend down the spine of the Appalachian Mountains into the Smoky Mountains north of here. So here's a picture of that historic range of the three main tree species that are found in these subalpine spruce-fir forests. These range maps were created by Little in 1971, and they sort of recorded where at the time there were records of these species occurring. And you can see that there's a lot of overlap in the northeastern United States and Maine and Vermont and New Hampshire. But then if you follow these small patches down, those are sort of going where the Appalachian Mountains and the different mountain chains are extending to the south. So why do we care particularly about red spruce, but also about these spruce-fir forests? In the 1980s and 70s, there was a lot of concern because you saw a lot of dead trees of red spruce in particular in the northern Appalachians. So this is an example from Camel's Hump from 1981, and this generated a ton of scientific research, like what is causing mortality and dieback of red spruce, what's happening, how can we understand this? And there were sort of even big scientific debates and controversial hypotheses about what might be causing it. And so one of the hypotheses was acidic rain, acid rain, and acidic deposition that was coming sort of from point source pollution in different parts of the eastern US. And so the results of that research, we now have a pretty good understanding of the physiology and what caused some of that damage. And now what we're seeing 30 to 40 years later is we're seeing a lot of different lines of evidence that are showing a rebound in red spruce trees and populations. And a lot of that can be attributed to changes in pollution control. So this was an article from 2018 related to research looking at tree rings that was showing tree ring growth expanding in red spruce over time. And they described sort of how these images like this one, the images of dead trees littering mountains in the 1980s, helped inspire changes to the Clean Air Act in 1990. And those amendments by George H.W. Bush in 1989 did mandate reductions in certain gas emissions, and that boosted regulation of toxic pollutants. So there's been this improving air quality in the last 30 years that's resulted from this, or has accompanied this Clean Air Act amendment. So we're seeing some good news related to these forests, but we're still concerned about what might be happening as those environmental biophysical trends change. So just to orient you, this is sort of what we can look at, what a montane spruce-fir forest might look like at the highest elevations, at the top of a mountain. You get in the northern part of the Appalachians, you get a lot of balsam fir, and it might be growing in this very like chrome-holesy, short environment where it's very stressed from wind, rime ice. These forests are often bathed in cloud cover. It can be covered in clouds up to 60% of the times. They get a lot of moisture from that interception of the cloud vapor. But as you go down in elevation from those high elevation sites, you get more of a mix of balsam fir, Abies balsamea, red spruce, and white mountain birch. And in these, you have a lot of critical habitat for different species. You have bick-nosed thrush in the northern Appalachians that really relies on these habitats. You also have Canada lynx, which is relying on those habitats and looking for snowshoe hare and that sort of thing in these types of forests. In the southern Appalachians, I can get rid of this. Okay, in the southern Appalachians, you have habitat. They're very biodiverse, number one, but you have habitat for different species like the Carolina Northern flying squirrel and the spruce-fir moss spider that are only found really in these habitats and these environments. So there's a lot of interest in both conserving them and seeing how they can persist over time. Now below the montane spruce-fir zone, you have more of a transition forest. So you start to get into that deciduous hardwood forest. It's typically going to be made up of species like sugar maple, American beech, and yellow birch. And it might look something like this. So you have a mix of something like red spruce in the understory, and then you have a lot of these deciduous trees. So why are we concerned about the montane forest? Big reason is because the temperatures are warming. This is a graph from a paper by Kamilkar and Bradley in 2017. And what this shows is the historical anomaly of temperatures globally. And then it shows how projections for the continental US differ from a global mean projection. And basically what this shows is this time period between the 80s and sort of the 2020s when you see this period of concern for red spruce and sort of a rebound to now. We've had this increase in temperature globally. And then for the continental US, that's the solid line under different scenarios of emissions and warming temperatures. Continental US in different regions is actually warming faster than the global mean. So there's a lot of hypotheses about what this means for where tree species may be located in the future. Generally, the way people think about this is that if you look at sort of what a current climate is, and this map shows sort of core scale estimates of where the spruce-fir forests are in dark green on the far right. And then you can see that gold color is that maple beech forest that would be at the lower elevations in those sites. Under different climate change scenarios, which you see a lower emission scenario and a higher emission scenario, you can project where is the mean kind of climate similar to what those forests exist in today. And what you see is the climate that we expect those forests to exist in kind of disappears. There's no dark green on the two maps on the right. And so what we see is that those sort of boundaries, those maybe ecotones, transition zones between forest types are expected to move to northern latitudes. So we expect this latitudinal shift over time to happen. That's sort of a general expectation. And in mountains, we also expect to see these shifts in composition, but it's more of an elevational shift because at the highest elevations, that's where you have colder temperatures because of the way that temperature is distributed through altitude. And in this case, you can see those spruce-fir forests at the high elevation, and again, those maple hardwood forests. And if we think about what this means with climate change, we would expect those lower elevation maple hardwood forests to eventually migrate upslope and displace subalpine spruce-fir forests over time, because they'll be able to better compete in that environment. So those are our expectations. Now, we have to remember that tree migration is intergenerational. So they're not mobile, they're sessile. They have to migrate by sending out propagules. And those propagules have to establish and grow and then reproduce and send out propagules. So, and they have to do it through an existing forest matrix. So if we look at just this montane spruce-fir forest, we see this like blanket of regeneration. And any northern hardwood species that are coming up are going to have to establish and compete in this environment some of the time. So while the climate is changing, there's a population process going on here that is going to mediate how long it's going to take before we sort of see those changes in forest composition. So what this suggests is that this could take variable amounts of time, and we don't really know how long it's going to take yet at this point to see those changes. So forest disturbances are one way you can open up new growing space that might allow something like those northern hardwood species to move up in elevation if that were to continue happening. These are some examples of canopy dieback caused by a lot of insects or pathogens, like the balsam woolly adelgid or the hemlock woolly adelgid. So there are processes that can increase that pace of change. And just to put this in the context of southern Appalachians, these are some recent images from Hurricane Helene damage in the Smoky Mountains. The middle one in this with snow is from the Unica Mountains. And you can see this is one of those areas where you have a lot of spruce-fir composition. This one as well from Roan Mountain, where someone's walking along the trail. So there's been a lot of deciduous blowdowns resulted from that in different areas, but there is also been an impact on the spruce-fir forest here. So these are ongoing processes that change things. So research question that we were looking to answer with the research I'm talking about today is just this question: has the spruce-fir forest receded to higher elevations as we expect, based on these changes in climate, et cetera? The data I'm using is a combination of satellite data. So we can look at the forest canopy, how many leaves are in the canopy using remote sensing data. And we can do that over time with a satellite data set like Landsat, because that's been collecting data in a consistent manner since, mid-80s or so, for the TM sensor. So that's one tool we're using. Then we also want to link that or understand how that relates to forest measurements on the ground. So generally we're measuring forest plots, or we're using data that's been measured on the ground to look at demographic changes. So which tree species are growing, where do we see mortality, and where do you see ingrowth or recruitment from smaller size classes? And how can we relate that to what we see from space? So one way we did this initially, this is a paper from 2015 that I worked on with Tony D'Amato. Initially, we looked just at a regional analysis in basically Vermont and New Hampshire. And we went to, so there's ecotone regions where we expect to see that in addition to the spruce-fir forest. And we sort of looked at a vegetation index. So if you've worked with satellite data at all and learned about it, you can use just to index a number that you get from the reflectance of light that tells you sort of roughly how much canopy vegetation there is. And what we can do is look at when all the deciduous trees have lost their leaves. That's this light blue color on a mountain slope. We can compare that to the area where you have evergreen trees. That's this dark red color at the top of the mountains. And we can look between time periods. So 1991, the red color is sort of thin. It's not very filled in, basically, those forest types. By 2010, we see a lot more regeneration in that evergreen forest. And what that does is it actually shows the elevation at which that transition zone happens. Here we have elevation of the x-axis, basically shifts downslope for this particular example. So we can do this on mountain slopes across this entire region of the White and Green Mountains, and then summarize the results. And in this particular case, as I pointed out, we actually saw that ecotone expanding to lower elevations, which was not our expectation. So what did we find for that regional study? When we added up all the occurrences, so for each mountain slope that we examined using satellite data, we added up whether or how much the ecotone shifted to a lower elevation is a negative value, or to a higher elevation is a positive value. And what we saw from the distribution was that on average, those ecotones were actually expanding to lower elevations. So that was a surprising result with spruce and fir, and not really what we were expecting when we initially looked at this. There's a big spike at 0, so there's a lot of stability in that ecotone where there's not a lot of change. And there is some change where you see a regression to higher elevations. But on average, we were seeing more of that dynamic where you see an expansion. And just to look at those data another way, you can sort of look at the top of that transition zone and the bottom of that transition zone and look at a violin plot, which shows a distribution for different time periods where we had image data. And again, the mean trends were to a lower elevation. Well, in the Green Mountains, it was at both the top of that boundary and the lower boundary, and in the White Mountains, only one of the boundaries, the top boundary had a significant expansion to lower elevations. So from that study, we wanted to try to ask a broader question and say, across that entire range of these montane spruce-fir forests, where do we observe this pattern, or where can we see there's rebound, recovery, or expansion of montane spruce-fir? So we took those, or we can look at those historic ranges from Little. What we did is take another study by Cogmell and White from 1991, where they modeled where you find that ecotone based on elevation and latitude. And we took their model and we sort of expanded it a little bit and came up with this study area in dark blue. So that's where our study area is. You can see we have a southern Appalachian zone, which again are these much smaller patches. They're often called sky islands just because of the way the topography and climate interact. Central Appalachians, and then different mountain zones here in the north. And what we did was take Landsat time series. So this is like different images from the satellite for every year. We look at the condition of the evergreen forest canopy by looking at leaf-off imagery, and then we can look at trends over time. So we know that when there's more evergreen forest canopy, the vegetation index increases, and when we see an increasing trend over time, we can link that with those field-based measurements and understand what it means. So Landsat has 30-meter spatial resolution. It's sort of looking at a cohort scale summary of what the canopy is doing, and it can show you those changes in abundance and trends in composition. So you can hopefully catch that expansion in understory spruce-fir if it's occurring. And this is some work that's in preparation. So what did we find? These maps show those trends using sort of colors that basically you can take the slope of a linear regression through those vegetation indices and see where you have increasing abundance in okay, so I won't touch it. Increasing abundance, well, so that may make it easier. In these red areas, you can see there are increases in abundance of the spruce-fir forests. The green areas are stable, so they've been spruce-fir and they've remained spruce-fir. And anything in the blue color would have been spruce-fir and had a decline. So what we see is we see red areas at the lower elevation, sort of like aprons around some of these mountains. This is the White Mountains. We see a similar pattern in the Adirondacks, like Whiteface Mountain up in here. That's where that is. So, but we have this was using Google Earth Engine, so that's a cloud-based platform to analyze large data sets of remote sensing. But what this allows us to do is look over a really large area at those and find those areas where you see this expansion or increases in abundance in spruce and fir at subalpine elevations. So just to illustrate this a little bit for you, what I've been talking about, this is an example from the Adirondacks. This is Whiteface Mountain, and these yellow points are long-term research plots that some other research groups have collected composition data on over time. And so we can just look at one of those plot locations in the red zone, and this is what the vegetation index looks like over time. So again, this high numbers show there's a lot of leaf area. Low numbers would be low leaf area. So what we can see with this plot over time, it's like from 1980s through, in this case, 2015 or 2020, is that you've had high seasonal variation in the beginning. So that aligns with a deciduous forest or deciduous dominated forest because it has a leaf-off period. And what we see is it's sort of mostly deciduous, but we see at the bottom increasing over time. And so what that is telling you is there's an evergreen component coming in and it's increasing in abundance. And so you're getting more of an evergreen component over time. So what we're looking at with this map is just that leaf-off period, so the bottom of that line, and you can fit a trend line through any of those, and then we're mapping that slope over time. So that's kind of what all those colors mean. That's what the data looks like. What does it mean when you kind of hike through an area? Here's Blue Mountain in this map. And if we start at a lower elevation, this is sort of what you might see is a deciduous forest with that small understory of spruce and fir. And as you go up the mountain, you're starting to see like recruitment of the larger size classes. Up higher still in that zone, you're seeing larger below canopy trees. And then once you're getting really at that top of that ecotone, you're seeing something like this. So you're seeing a mostly spruce-fir dominated forest. You have some dead Yale birch in the back there. You're getting some dynamics that explain some of what you're seeing. So this analysis extends down through the Smoky Mountains. This is an example of the same kind of map, but for the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And here you see some different patterns. So here you're seeing more of the mountain tops having a regenerating signal. And so there are some interesting patterns going on here. We don't see as much of an expansion to lower elevations in the Smokies, and there are probably some reasons for that we can discuss. But I think what's going on here a lot here is that you did have dieback in the Smokies in the 80s and 90s from Balsamolia delta in that zone. And so there's been regeneration of both species. And one way we can look at that, well, I'll wait for that, but I will show you some forest plot data that helps us make inferences about what could be causing that. So from these maps, we summarize them by region to try and understand, okay, what are these different regions, what's going on? So the region of Southern Alps, the Central Appalachians, the Catskill Mountains, Adirondacks, and then in order to look at the forest inventory data from the National Forest Inventory, divided the top 3 states just into the state level data, because a lot of inventory data is distributed in that way. And so what did we found when we summarized the patterns at those regional levels? This is the mean trend in those changes in abundance from Landsat data by region. And so what we see here is that we have a significantly positive trend in sort of over all of those study areas in these regions. We're seeing this increasing abundance in spruce and fir in Maine, New Hampshire, Adirondacks, and the Central Appalachians. So the Smoky Mountains are more overlapping with 0. We're not seeing a significant increase. Catskills are relatively low, and Vermont is also below 0. And so there's some interesting regional or within region variations there. But basically across a lot of the regions, we're seeing that increase in abundance and extent, but it's complex and varies by region. So in order to understand these patterns from the remote sensing, we then went to these forest plot data that get remeasured periodically in a systematic way. The forest inventory analysis, or FIA data, is the National Forest Inventory. And we summarized those data in the same regions with the same elevations to understand how the dominant species might be changing, how much mortality and growth is happening, et cetera. And so when we did that, each region has an arrow here that roughly corresponds to, do you see an increase in this case, I think I just put the red spruce information, but it's similar with both the fir and spruce. So we saw from a region remeasurement 2010 to 2015 that the red spruce was increasing in the overstory more than it was decreasing everywhere except for the Catskills. And that amount is 0.06 to 0.2 tons of carbon per hectare per year. Some of those numbers can be quite high, actually. They can, in some cases, yeah, anyway, there's a lot of regeneration. We do see that in the sapling layer as well. I think what I wanted to say about that actually was the increases you see in the sapling layer can be as high as what you see in that increment in the overstory layer. So there's things happening at different levels in the forest and multi-cohort stands developing in some of these regions. We broke some of this data out by species, and what this plot shows, so there's species on the x-axis, each bar is a different species, and the different colors correspond to overstory trees. The light gray is overstory trees that survived between remeasurement and grew, so it's growth of overstory trees. The dark gray is ingrowth, so large, smaller trees that grew into that overstory size class. So that's recruitment into the overstory. And then red is something that has died over that period. So we can kind of consider that a loss from the live tree pool. And basically what you're looking for is having more growth and ingrowth than you're having mortality. And for red spruce here, we see a much bigger increment above the line than below. There's very little mortality. And for balsam fir, and in this case, this is showing for the New Hampshire data, similarly, much higher growth and ingrowth than mortality. There are some interesting dynamics among competitor species. So here we have paper birch. There's a lot of mortality. So that's a shorter lived species, sorry. What did I do? Don't know what I did. There we go. Oh. That's a shorter lived species, and it also has some other decline things going on. But this kind of makes sense with what we see from the remote sensing data. In the central Appalachians, here's what the FIA data looks like when you look at remeasurement. Again, for that red spruce, we're seeing more growth and ingrowth than mortality. For FIA data, interestingly, in the central Apps actually doesn't have balsam fir or Fraser fir in it, although those species do occur there. They're just more rare and don't come up in that systematic sample. But you see a lot of loss of American beech. So there's beech bark disease is a big mortality factor for overstory beech. So again, you see a deciduous competitor that's having this its own struggles, and so it might not compete the way we think with these species. And in the southern Appalachians, of course, there's more species. I think I've only limited this list to the most common species. There are definitely more tree species. Again, you see a lot more growth in red spruce than mortality. Not so much for Fraser fir. You do actually see more growth in growth and mortality, but it's very small. And that's again because you have this balsy woolly adelgid introduced invasive insect that causes a lot of mortality in that species. And in this zone, you have a lot of mortality of hemlock woolly adelgid. And also you see that with beech as well. So what these different lines of evidence are showing us is that there's this change is happening. We see it both on the ground and from space. So we want to understand why. Okay, we see it happening, you can see where, and we want to understand why. So what we did was try to gather large spatial data sets of different environmental variables that we could then use to model and try and explain the variation in patterns that we see. And so for that, we are using Bayesian models that let us test hypotheses about what's driving the changes that we see. The different variables that we've included are climatic drivers of change. So again, we know that there's been that increase in temperature over time. This is a study from Patrick Gonzalez in 2018 that shows just an increasing trend in mean annual temperature. And this was focused on sort of how US national parks are exposed to climate change. But what this map really shows well is this warming hole, is what it gets called a lot of the time. And what this means is that this part of the country actually has had less warming than the rest of the country. So there's variation along that spine of the Appalachians and how much warming has happened over the last century or so. So that's sort of interesting, and we'll come back to that. Just to see how this affects the data. One of the variables we've included is minimum annual temperature. And you can see how that differs. This is from a monthly climate data set called TopoWX. It's a temperature data set. And if we summarize it over 30 years by region, then the southern Appalachians has a higher minimum temperature. It doesn't get as cold in the south as it does in the north. It's still -5, so it gets pretty cold on average. but then you get down to like -20 in Maine. But what you see is maybe what you would expect for minimum temperatures. However, if we look at a trend in mean annual temperature, so something like what that prior map showed, it looks something like this. And what you see is that there's a much lower trend in the southern and central Appalachians as compared to those northern Appalachian sites. So these sites have only been increasing by about 0.02 degrees Celsius per year in mean annual temperature versus 2 to 3 times that. So there's some interesting differences in the experience of changes in climate. We know that acid rain has been a factor in red spruce decline over time. So we gathered maps from this data set called the National Atmospheric Deposition Program. And we can use those to estimate how much acid deposition there was at the start of our time series. And then we can look at trends over time if we want to. So, but just to illustrate with this map, this is a trend map of those acid deposition data, so nitrogen and sulfur in particular, and most of the values are negative, and that's because the air quality has been improving. Like there's been a huge reduction in that deposition over time. And this is just an example of some needle damage that happens early with that. Okay, so the other thing we want to look at is just stand dynamics. How does forest dispersal, demographics affect these processes? And to do that, we're using sort of spatial adjacency measures. This one's called the cost distance measure. And what that does is just incorporate a difference in elevation with your sort of X and Y coordinates when you're looking at a map. So we can look at a source population of spruce and say, how much does change depend on having a source population nearby or far away? And finally, disturbance. We want to estimate like how much stand replacing disturbance might be going on. How is that affecting those trends? Because we know that can open up growing space over time. So we use a different satellite-based disturbance maps that are really good at mapping disturbances that are stand replacing. Okay, so what did we find when we did this analysis? So this is just related to those source populations of spruce-fir. One interesting pattern we see is that if you look at the proportion of the study areas in each region, a couple areas have very little spruce-fir relative to what we expect, and those are the Catskills in Vermont. And then in the other regions, it's closer to 30 to 40% of those high elevation zones have spruce-fir. So there is some variation in those factors, and that might explain some of the differences in trends, mean trends that we saw. So we looked at all these different factors. This is sort of precipitation, trend in mean annual temperature. These are fixed effects from a Bayesian model predicting the change in spruce-fir. The dark black bars are significant. And what we see is that they're basically those trends in abundance increase with latitude. So at northern elevations, they increase with elevation on average, and with nitrate deposition. And then if there was a lot of spruce-fir to begin with, tend to see a lower trend, and that sort of makes sense because it's sort of an occupancy measure. You can't really get higher if you're full of something. And then if you have disturbance, we saw some fixed effects of those different variables over time. Then we allowed some of those responses to vary by region. And what we saw was different effects based on which region you were in. So I don't think I have too much time to talk about these, but basically this first slide is showing you stand dynamics effects. So those dispersal related ones or distance to a source population. And what we see is just that these do vary by region. So distance from a spruce-fir existing population at the start of that time in the 80s sort of was more important in northern regions and declined until it's not really important in the south. And disturbance also had a different effect by region. For climate and acid deposition effects, we saw a lot of variability among those regions. And just to point out a few, that trend in mean annual temperature. So what we see is in the southern regions and the central Appalachians, we see a negative effect of that trend in mean. So that increasing temperature is having a negative effect. But interestingly, it's in the zone where there hasn't been that much change in those things. So that maybe suggests that those might be more sensitive to changes that happen in this region over over time, and also in northern Maine, which is a little bit surprising. And then for acid deposition here, looking at the sulfate so the legacy of acid deposition, we can see that there's a negative effect of having had a lot of deposition over time before those changes in air quality. And there's also an interaction with those high rates of deposition and those cold minimum temperatures. And that's kind of consistent with red spruce physiology and our understanding of how that dieback we think was triggered. So there is an interaction. I think I'm not going to go into too much of it, but basically where you do have that legacy of sulfate deposition, spruce-fir is doing better kind of where winter temperatures are a little bit warmer. So we're still working to tease apart these results and update it with some of the new Landsat data. But what we're seeing is variation in those regions and a lot of recovery, but some areas where we don't see it as much. So before I summarize, I just wanted to say now forests are dynamic. And so we're thinking about Hurricane Helene and what's just happened in the Smoky Mountains. This is a recent, I think it came out this week, damage assessment map from the North Carolina Forest Service. The darker red colors are more damaged. And this is again, that photo from the Smoky Mountains. So, you know, all these trends that we've been seeing now, there's been a big disturbance and there's going to be a lot of cascading repercussions in these forests over time. And I know a lot of groups that work in them and work with those wildlife populations in those regions are really, you know, concerned and waiting to see what might happen. So a few conclusions, just basically that red spruce has been increasing in abundance and extent in different parts of its range throughout the eastern US. But those changes in composition are complex and they do vary by region and sometimes it might have to do with other competitors' experiences, disease and dieback. We do see this interaction between warmer winters and declining sulfate deposition, and that may favor red spruce recovery in the northeastern US. So I hope that this can be like some good news. This is sort of an encouraging example of where we see some positive regrowth in a species that we're concerned about. But for those spruce-fir forests in the Smoky Mountains, those are not expanding in that same way. They're sort of maybe regenerating where they've been occupied before, but there's different disease dynamics going on there. And they've also in the past experienced less warming. And so if that warming hole dynamic does change in the southeastern US, it raises the question of what might be expected. And that sort of, there's a lot of uncertainty around what happens with things like cloud height and those clouds that bathe the forest so much of the time. What's going to happen with those with climate change? There's a lot of climate variables that we need to understand better to really understand why these forests are changing. But that take-home message is that these data are suggesting that those improvements in air quality may be delaying some negative effects of climate change. And I think that can be a really positive message and hopefully we can look into that further. So with that, I just want to thank my co-authors on this work and a lot of collaborators who've worked on different parts of this over the year. And I'll take questions.
So you directly connected it with temperature and all of that, but is there any possible correlation with like societal trends like the loss of fire? You know, in the modern era, so post 1940, you know, is there anything like it was taking out? How fire tolerant are they, or?
Yeah, no, not fire tolerant. So that, yeah, they're not thought to be fire tolerant. But I think what your question brings to mind is sort of that land use history, land use change over that whole time period, and there is a lot of that in this story, and so that's a piece that's harder to bring in. Especially with red spruce, it was selectively harvested out of a lot of these high elevation areas because it was a super valuable wood for different purposes. And so one hypothesis is that one reason we see it expanding to lower elevations is because that was its historical, you know, pre-settlement range that we just don't see when we look at it in the more recent data. So it could just be that these forests were occupying these areas before and they're just resettling there. But we don't necessarily have the kind of spatial data where we could say, like, I know that this used to be this in the 1880s to the 1930s or something like that. But so I don't know. I think, and with fire, in the Smoky Mountains, there is a history of a lot of logging of the high elevation forests where spruce-fir were. And what you see is pretty good recovery in areas that weren't burned, but the areas that were logged and then burned in those high elevation forests where, you know, there's a lot of stuff consumed and everything, is where groups that are working on restoration efforts are really interested in those areas because the logging and fire in these high elevation forests is pretty damaging to allowing these species to recover. So that's a good question. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mhm. Yeah.
Is there any possibility for bugs or wildlife behavior changes from climate change to impact the distribution of deciduous and evergreen trees?
Yeah, so the question is there a possibility for bugs and wildlife distributions to change the
Distributions and behavior changes.
and behavior changes to change the distribution of the evergreen and hardwood species with climate change? And so yeah, I think we're seeing huge effects basically from certainly insect and disease impacts on specific species. So where we saw those big changes in species composition, say in remeasured forest plot data, most of the times where we see a lot of mortality, that is an insect related or a disease related complex that's causing mortality, these longer red lines. And so I guess that's an interesting question though, with the behavior related to climate change. For some of the species of insects or diseases, sometimes there's an expectation that outbreaks will get worse as it gets warmer, because some species of insects can have multiple generations in a year and that allows them to grow much more rapidly. I don't know specifically for the ones we can look at here if that's the case. For wildlife species, I know less than that, but there are a lot of implications for the wildlife species, I would say. Particularly in the northern Appalachians where you do have lynx or moose, using these habitats that have, like moose have very specific just thermal requirements, like they can't get too hot. So they need like this combination of ways to stay cool. And the lynx I know are relying on snowshoe hare, and there's important like snow related factors there. So I think there's a lot of questions. There's a lot of room for research on that topic, but thank you. Yeah.
The Catskills seem like an outlier. What's going on?
Yeah, the Catskills is sort of a weird outlier, and so I think I threw in, and I don't show the plot data from that, but I think I threw in this graph here, maybe because I think this partly explains it. So what this means is there's very little spruce fir to be in that potential area. So those potential locations where you would predict it to be, there's very little. Now, there is a paper somewhere where someone's looked at pollen data, so back to the last glaciation, and I feel like it correlated with this. So it may be this outlier that has had less spruce fir for much longer than we're talking about here. But I can't remember. I have to look that paper up again. So there could be a land use history question. These little mountain ranges, or some of them, they do have a different orographic history. So that's sort of longer term. They can have different bedrock geology that could also play into how well those species do there. But the other thing, I guess the other possibility that I thought about is the temperature data. So it sort of is both, I don't know, I feel like there's some similarities between the data for Catskills and Vermont. So southern Vermont probably and Catskills are maybe similar. So there may be a climate similarity that they might be a little bit warmer. I don't think I have I only have minimum temperatures here, but when you look at the max temperatures, so summer temperatures, they may be at a higher level. So it's a question, and I don't know the answer, but maybe we can talk about it.
So how does precipitation and changes in precipitation affect?
Yeah, so far, what we've seen for precipitation is, I don't think I included changes in precipitation in this model that I showed. We can certainly look at that. But with just mean precipitation within a region, what you see is more increase in red spruce and balsam fir where you have more precipitation. So that makes sense. It's those higher elevation sites, they're getting more rain. So I think in general, the moister, wetter environments can be better for their recovery. But what we don't have a really good handle on, again, is that cloud immersion kind of dynamic, because that's not what we get summarized into a big gridded climate data product that we can use. And I think it's probably more important in these environments than some of the other variables we can measure. So
changes in precipitation haven't had.
I don't think I put
Yes.
the trend in to this model, but I am updating these models for a new batch of Landsat data. So maybe that would be something for there. I know that like in the Northeast, there are projections of increasing precipitation. In the Southeast is already, a lot of it is so wet. Like you guys, there's a lot of moisture down here. And then some of those other areas probably projected to have a little bit less, but yeah, and then is it snow or is it rain or is it intercepted fog, that sort of thing. So stay tuned. We're still trying to understand.
I found it interesting seeing the warming hole in your map, because it's like the exact opposite of what we experienced this last summer. Cause like that was the exact area, like all of the east, even up to the north, experiencing the kind of like insane heat wave we had.
Yeah,
And that made me wonder, like, in future studies that are kind of like looking at the same thing, like if this became a trend, this heat wave, how many years do you think it would take for like us to see a significant decline? Or like would high elevation sites even be really that impacted by like a widespread heat wave? Or do they normally stay a bit protected?
yeah, you know, that's a really good question. And so I don't know I'm not a climate scientist. I don't know exactly why that pattern of variation and change has happened. There's, it's certainly related to like our large scale atmospheric circulation and the jet stream and everything. And so there are people that can explain that. But I think, yes, that this past year has been, I think, the warmest on record. It's on trend to be the warmest on record. It's been hot. We all know that. It's been really dry, at least in the last month or so. And so it's hard to know what are their tipping points, basically. Like, could you have a year like that if it were at high elevations? It certainly have a huge effect on these forests. And that's again why this, like, those cloud cover kind of variables that we don't have good measurements on are really important. And also fine scale temperature measurements. So a lot of times these high elevation areas, they don't have great temperature data, because for the long records of like temperature station data was usually near human settlements and sort of valley bottoms or not even like flatter areas. So there's a lot of efforts going on to use sort of distributed microclimate sensor networks and that sort of thing to better characterize, okay, what are the actual temperatures in these zones? You know, when there's a heat wave, like what's going on in a lot of these different micro topography areas where these forests are occurring. So I think there's a lot of interest in that. And yeah, I think, I don't know the answer, but I think this has been a really warm year, and it certainly is showing effects on the forests at lower elevations, I would say. But what those are going to be long-term, we're still measuring, I think. So yeah, good question. Mhm.
Right, thank you again.
I know, I walked in. Yeah.
Just, in. And. Well, but then it's also, I guess, when. Like, you're just.